Picture, if you will, a ballroom frozen in time, its door replaced by a window sometime around 1920, sealing off one of Newport's most magnificent chambers from the world for decades, its vaulted Gothic ceiling gathering dust while the ghosts of 1,000 glittering parties whispered through the darkness, and here, in this deliberate act of architectural erasure, lies not just the story of one room but the entire trajectory of American wealth in the Gilded Age, a tale that begins with the most ostentatious display of fortune ever conceived on Rhode Island's rocky shore and ends with a question that haunts us still: what price was paid for all this beauty, and by whom, and was the cost, measured in human labor, in social cruelty, in the grinding machinery of class warfare, ever truly accounted for before the music stopped and the chandeliers went dark? This is the story of Belcourt, though for 56 years it pretended to be something grander, calling itself Belcourt Castle as if a French surname and an architect's vision could transmute new money into old, and it is fundamentally a dark story, one that the ballroom itself, sealed off, abandoned, transformed, and finally restored, tells better than any history book, because that room, with its 13th-century stained glass windows torn from a French chateau and its Gothic arches soaring 40 feet toward a hammer-beam ceiling, represents everything the Gilded Age wanted to be and everything it actually was, the fairy tale and the nightmare existing in the same space, separated only by the thickness of a wall and the willingness to look behind it, and if we're honest, truly honest, about what these walls would tell us if they could speak, we'd hear not just the tinkling of champagne glasses and the rustle of silk gowns but the thunder of hooves on marble floors, the whispers of 30 liveried servants whose names we'll never know, the desperate calculations of a banking fortune built on Rothschild gold during the Panic of 1837, the social warfare waged by women who understood that acceptance in Newport society meant survival and exclusion meant annihilation, the transformation of a grieving widow into America's most formidable suffragist, and finally, the slow, inexorable decay that overtakes every monument to hubris when the money runs out and the world moves on, leaving behind only questions: why was that ballroom sealed? What happened in those lost decades when Belcourt stood empty and crumbling? And what does it mean that we've spent millions restoring the glittering surface while barely beginning to excavate the darker truths beneath? Let's begin in 1813, not in Newport but in Frankfurt, Germany, because you cannot understand Belcourt without understanding where the money came from, and the money came from August Schönberg, born into a Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt, born into a world where Jews could not own land, could not hold public office, could not walk certain streets after dark, could not exist except in the narrow spaces that Christian Europe grudgingly allowed them, but young August was brilliant, ambitious, ruthless. And he understood that the Rothschild family, the greatest Jewish banking dynasty in Europe, needed agents in the New World, needed representatives willing to cross the Atlantic and establish their interests in America, and so in 1837, at the age of 23, August Schönberg arrived in New York City carrying letters of credit from the Rothschilds and a new surname, Belmont, French for Beautiful Mountain, a name that severed his connection to his Jewish origins as efficiently as a knife cuts rope, and he arrived at the perfect moment, at the exact instant when the Panic of 1837 was destroying American fortunes, when banks were collapsing, when credit was evaporating, when the Rothschild American investments were threatened with total loss, and August Belmont, this 23-year-old immigrant with his fabricated French name and his very real Rothschild backing, stepped into the chaos and saved everything. He preserved the Rothschild portfolio, he bought distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, he established August Belmont and Company as one of the most powerful investment houses in America, and within a decade he had accomplished what few Jewish immigrants ever managed. He had married into American naval aristocracy, taking as his wife Caroline Slidell Perry, daughter of Commodore Matthew Perry, who had opened Japan to Western trade, and niece of Oliver Hazard Perry, the great naval hero of the War of 1812, and with that marriage August Schönberg, the boy from the Frankfurt ghetto, became August Belmont, the father-in-law of American naval glory, and he had 6 children with Caroline, and the youngest, born on November 12, 1858, was named Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont after his mother's heroic uncle, and this boy, this child of Rothschild banking gold and American naval glory, would grow up to build the mansion we're discussing, but first we need to understand what it meant to be August Belmont's son in the 1870s and 1880s, what it meant to have unlimited wealth but contested legitimacy, to have millions of dollars but whispers following you through every Newport ballroom, to know that your father had hidden his Jewish origins so successfully that most of society had forgotten them but not quite everyone, not quite completely, and the exclusions were never quite explained, the snubs were never quite acknowledged, but they happened, constantly, persistently, and young Oliver Belmont grew up. Watching his father spend millions on art and horses and political influence and social positioning, watching him try to buy with money what could not quite be bought, watching him almost succeed, almost gain full acceptance into the 400 families that Mrs. Caroline Astor had decreed were the only families that mattered, but not quite, never quite, always almost but never fully, and Oliver learned from this. Learned that wealth alone was insufficient, learned that display mattered. Learned that the performance of legitimacy required constant vigilance, exhausting effort, and a willingness to spend without limit on the symbols of belonging. In 1891, Oliver Belmont was 33 years old, recently divorced from his first wife Sarah Swan Whiting in a scandal that had thrilled Newport society, heir to a fortune estimated at over $100 million in today's money, and obsessed with two things: horses and architecture. And these were not separate obsessions but rather two aspects of the same desperate need to prove that Belmont wealth was as legitimate as Vanderbilt wealth, as authentic as Astor wealth, as worthy of respect as any fortune built by old Knickerbocker families, and so Oliver purchased a plot of land on Bellevue Avenue, that golden mile where America's wealthiest families competed to outbuild and outdisplay one another, where the breakers was rising for the Vanderbilts and Marble House would soon be constructed for Alva Vanderbilt, and Oliver commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the greatest American architect of his generation, the man who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and who understood European architecture better than any American, and Oliver told Hunt to build him something unprecedented, a 60-room summer cottage whose entire first floor would be devoted to luxury accommodations for 30 horses and their carriages, with the human living quarters on the second and third floors above, because Oliver loved horses more than he loved people, loved them with a passion that society found simultaneously amusing and disturbing, loved them enough to give them the finest accommodations in Newport, marble stalls imported from Italy, mahogany paneling, sterling silver fixtures, a ventilation system so advanced that the horses lived in more comfort than 99% of Americans, and upstairs, on the second floor, Oliver instructed Hunt to create a ballroom that would rival anything in Newport, a Gothic masterpiece spanning 60 feet in length with a hammer beam ceiling soaring 40 feet overhead, with walls lined with authentic 13th-century stained glass windows that Oliver personally purchased from a chateau near Rouen, France, windows depicting saints and biblical scenes, windows that had survived wars and revolutions and the collapse of feudalism only to be purchased by an American millionaire and shipped across the Atlantic because that's what you did if you were Oliver Belmont. You didn't commission replicas. You didn't settle for imitations, you bought the actual artifacts of European civilization and transplanted them to American soil as if the mere possession of medieval stained glass could grant you the legitimacy that your grandfather's Jewish surname and your father's immigrant origins had denied you. Construction of Belcourt took 4 years, from 1891 to 1895, and every detail was obsessively, exhaustingly perfect. Hunt designed the exterior to resemble the hunting lodge of Louis XIII at Versailles, creating a chateau that looked like it had been lifted from the French countryside and deposited on Bellevue Avenue. The interior was a mad mixture of architectural styles: French Gothic in the ballroom, Italian Renaissance in the banquet hall, English Tudor in the library, German medieval in the armor hall, as if Oliver was trying to compress all of European civilization into one 60-room house, as if surrounding himself with enough authenticated antiquity could make him authentic too. And when Belcourt opened in 1895, Newport society gasped, not just at the opulence, not just at the unprecedented decision to give horses the entire first floor, but at the sheer desperate ambition of it all, the naked need for acceptance that every room broadcast, the way every architectural choice seemed to be an argument, a defense, a plea: accept me, respect me, acknowledge that my wealth is as legitimate as yours, that my taste is as refined as yours, that I belong here among you despite everything you know about where my money came from. The ballroom was the crown jewel, the space that was meant to seal Oliver's status as a serious collector and patron of the arts, 60 feet long and 40 feet high, with that extraordinary hammer beam ceiling composed of massive oak beams interlocking in a pattern that required extraordinary engineering and craftsmanship, with the 13th-century stained glass windows set into trefoil arches along the walls, with a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, with medieval tapestries hanging from the walls, with suits of armor standing guard in the corners, and Oliver filled this space with his collection, with more medieval armor, with Renaissance furniture, with Flemish paintings, with French chandeliers, with everything he could acquire that suggested depth, history, cultivation, legitimacy, and he hosted parties in this ballroom. Elaborate entertainments with orchestras and champagne and guest lists that included the most powerful people in America, and for a few brief years. From 1895 to 1896, it seemed to work, seemed like Oliver had finally achieved what his father August had spent a lifetime pursuing, seemed like the Belmonts had finally, definitively, arrived. But Oliver was alone, divorced, rattling around in 60 rooms with 30 horses and 30 servants and no family, no wife, no children, no one to share his Gothic ballroom or his marble horse stalls, and then in 1896, something extraordinary happened. Alva Vanderbilt, who lived next door at Marble House, who was one of the most famous and controversial women in America, who had just divorced her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt in a scandal that shocked even jaded Newport society, married Oliver Belmont. And if you want to understand what happens to Belcourt after this moment, if you want to understand why the ballroom was eventually sealed and what the house became and what it represents, you need to understand who Alva was, because she was perhaps the most ruthless social climber of the Gilded Age, a woman who had been born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, to a Southern family that had money and breeding but not enough of either to matter in New York, who had married William Kissam Vanderbilt purely for his railroad millions, who had spent those millions building Marble House as a monument to her own ambitions, who had literally forced her daughter Consuelo into marriage with the Duke of Marlborough, bribing and threatening and manipulating until Consuelo, weeping, walked down the aisle to marry a British aristocrat she barely knew and didn't love, all so that Alva could have a duchess for a daughter, all so that Alva could claim connection to European nobility, and then Alva had divorced William Vanderbilt, which in 1895 was simply not done, not by women of her class. Divorce was social death, divorce meant exile, divorce meant losing everything. Except Alva was Alva and she made different calculations. She understood that she had enough money to survive divorce, enough will to force society to accept her decision, enough strategic intelligence to remarry quickly, enough that the scandal would fade, and Oliver Belmont, her neighbor, her friend, her fellow social warrior, was the perfect second husband, wealthy enough that no one could accuse her of marrying for money, respectable enough that the marriage seemed plausible, isolated enough that he needed her as much as she needed him, and so on January 11, 1896, Alva Vanderbilt became Alva Belmont. And everything at Belcourt changed. Alva looked at Belcourt with its horses on the first floor and its Gothic ballroom on the second and its bachelor's quarters on the third, and she saw waste, she saw missed opportunities, she saw a stage that Oliver had built but didn't know how to use, because Oliver thought the house was about horses and architecture and collecting, thought that if he just assembled enough authenticated artifacts and displayed them beautifully enough, society would grant him the acceptance he craved. But Alva knew better. Alva understood that houses like Belcourt weren't homes, they were weapons, they were theaters of social combat, they were spaces where power was performed and contested and seized, and she immediately began transforming Belcourt. She moved the horses out, she converted the 13,000-square-foot first-floor stable into a banquet hall capable of seating 250 guests. She brought in more European treasures, more tapestries and armor and furniture. She reorganized the servants' quarters. She established protocols and hierarchies and routines that turned Belcourt from a bachelor's eccentric horse palace into a proper Newport showplace, and she used it, ruthlessly, brilliantly. She hosted dinners and balls and weekend parties that became legendary. She invited European aristocrats and American industrialists and politicians and artists. She seated them in her converted carriage house beneath medieval tapestries and Venetian chandeliers. She fed them elaborate multi-course meals prepared by French chefs and served by liveried footmen. She orchestrated every detail of every entertainment with the precision of a military campaign, and it worked. Belcourt under Alva's management became one of the premier venues in Newport. Invitations were coveted, attendance was mandatory if you wanted to maintain your position in society, and Alva and Oliver, the divorced socialite and the horseman banker, became one of the most powerful couples in Gilded Age America. But there was a cost. There was always a cost, and the cost was the 30 servants who made it all possible. Let's be clear about what it took to maintain Belcourt at presentation-ready status, because this is the part of the story that gets elided, that gets sealed off behind bay windows, that gets smoothed over in the tourist brochures and restoration publicity. It took 30 full-time servants working 18-hour days, 6 days a week, for approximately $100 per week total, which means each servant earned roughly $3 per week, $3 per week to maintain 60 rooms and 30 horse stalls and elaborate gardens and the constant entertainment schedule that Alva demanded, $3 per week to live in attic quarters with no heat in winter and no cooling in summer, to eat the leftover food from upstairs parties, to wear uniforms provided by the household but deducted from their wages, to obey without question, to work without complaint, to remain invisible except when their service was required, to have no lives, no families, no futures beyond their service to the Belmonts, and these servants had names, they had dreams, they had children they rarely saw and aging parents they couldn't help and debts they couldn't repay, but we don't know their names, we don't know their stories, because no one recorded them, no one thought they mattered, they were just the machinery, just the invisible hands that polished the silver and cleaned the stained glass and served the champagne and cleared the tables and washed the dishes and scrubbed the floors and made the beds and pressed the clothes and answered the bells and said, "Yes, ma'am," and, "Right away, sir," and disappeared back into the walls, and they lived their entire lives in service to people who never saw them, never knew them, never thought about them except when something went wrong, when the service was too slow or the silver not bright enough or the floors not clean enough, and then they were noticed, then they were reprimanded, then they were threatened with dismissal, with the loss of that $3 per week that meant survival, and this is what haunts Belcourt. Not literal ghosts but the accumulated weight of all that unacknowledged labor, all that stolen life, all those human beings who were treated as machines and who maintained the beautiful surface that allowed the Belmonts to perform legitimacy while the servants themselves lived in conditions that we would now recognize as exploitation bordering on slavery. And when Harl Tinney wrote her book about the ghosts of Belcourt, about the screaming suits of armor and the cursed chairs and the monk pacing the ballroom, she was telling the truth despite herself, because yes, Belcourt is haunted, yes, something is profoundly wrong in those rooms, yes, the beauty was purchased at a price we're only now beginning to calculate. For 12 years, from 1896 to 1908, Alva and Oliver ruled Belcourt and used it as their base of operations in the ongoing warfare of Newport society, and they were winning, they were at the absolute peak of their power, they had the money and the house and the social position, they had achieved everything they had fought for, and then on June 10, 1908, Oliver Belmont died, suddenly, shockingly. He had appendicitis, a routine condition, they operated, septic poisoning set in, and within days he was dead at the age of 49, and everything changed, because Alva, whatever else she was not sentimental, she didn't cling to Oliver's vision of Belcourt, she didn't maintain it as a shrine to his memory, she didn't even particularly want it, because Alva had discovered something more important than social position, more important than Newport entertainment, more important than the endless performance of wealth and legitimacy, she had discovered political power, real power, the power to change laws and break chains and force the government to recognize that women were human beings with rights, and after Oliver's death, Alva Belmont threw herself into the suffrage movement with the same ruthless energy she had once devoted to social climbing. She opened Marble House next door as a headquarters for suffrage organizing, she funded Alice Paul's National Woman's Party with millions of dollars. She organized rallies and marches and protests, she picketed the White House, she went to jail, she used her wealth and her social position and her extraordinary will to fight for the 19th Amendment, and Belcourt, Oliver's horse palace, his Gothic fantasy, his desperate monument to legitimacy, became irrelevant to her, became a burden, became something she wanted to sell, and she announced her intention to do so in December 1908, just 6 months after Oliver's death. But who wants a 60-room house designed for horses? Who needs a Gothic ballroom and 30 servants' quarters and all that imported European architecture? Perry Belmont bought it, Oliver's older brother, a diplomat and politician who had served in Congress and as minister to Spain, but Perry didn't love Belcourt the way Oliver had. Perry had his own houses, his own life, his own interests, and Belcourt to him was just another property, another asset, something to maintain minimally and use occasionally, and so the first decline began, subtle at first, barely noticeable, fewer parties, less maintenance, rooms closed off to save on heating costs. Servants dismissed, the elaborate protocols that Alva had established gradually abandoned, and then sometime around 1920, a decision was made that tells us everything we need to know about Belcourt's status at that moment. The ballroom, that soaring Gothic masterpiece that Oliver had created as proof of his legitimacy, that 60-foot chamber with its 13th-century stained glass and its hammer-beam ceiling and its medieval tapestries, was sealed off, closed, its main door replaced by a bay window, and the room simply ceased to exist as a functional space. Why? The records don't tell us precisely, but we can infer, we can read the architectural evidence like archaeologists reading pottery shards, and what the evidence suggests is that by 1920, the entire Gilded Age model of entertainment had become untenable, the cost of maintaining a ballroom that size, the servants required to keep it presentation ready, the heating bills, the insurance, the sheer expense of having 60 feet of Gothic grandeur sitting unused except for occasional parties, had become unbearable, and more than that, had become embarrassing, because World War I had changed everything, had killed millions of young men in European trenches, had exposed the bankruptcy of European civilization, had made the whole Gilded Age fantasy of medieval pageantry and Gothic romance seem obscene, seem like a sick joke, seem like evidence of moral failure. And the American aristocracy that had spent the 1890s and 1900s playing at medieval banquets in their Newport castles suddenly found themselves asked uncomfortable questions. Where were you when the world was burning? What did you do while millions died? How can you justify your wealth, your privilege, your Gothic ballrooms when the world outside is suffering? And they had no good answers, no answers at all, and so they did what wealthy people always do when confronted with uncomfortable questions. They sealed off the evidence, they closed the ballroom, they installed a bay window, they pretended that the whole performance had never happened, and Perry Belmont, dutiful if unimaginative steward of his brother's legacy, presided over this slow erasure, this gradual abandonment, and when he died in 1947 at the age of 90, having held on to Belcourt for 39 years without ever really living in it or loving it, the house passed to the Lorillard family, tobacco heirs who bought it as an investment, a speculative property, and then did essentially nothing with it for 9 years, 9 years from 1947 to 1956 when Belcourt stood mostly empty, mostly abandoned, its roof leaking, its plaster crumbling, its gardens overgrown, its stables rotting, its sealed ballroom gathering more dust and water damage and the accumulated detritus of neglect. And this period, these 9 lost years, represent something crucial about Gilded Age wealth. It doesn't last, it can't last, because it was never built to last, it was built to impress, to dominate, to demonstrate superiority in a specific social contest. And once that contest ended, once the Gilded Age gave way to World War I and the Depression and World War II and the vast social changes of the 20th century, these enormous houses became liabilities, became burdens, became white elephants that no one wanted and few could afford to maintain, and so they rotted, they burned, they were demolished, they were carved up into apartments, they were abandoned to weather and vandals and time, and Belcourt was heading for exactly that fate, heading for demolition or collapse or sale to developers who would tear it down and build condominiums on the valuable Bellevue Avenue land. Except in 1956, something improbable happened. Harold and Ruth Tinney, along with their son Donald, bought Belcourt for $25,000, a sum so absurdly low that it reveals just how worthless these Gilded Age monuments had become. $25,000 for 60 rooms and Richard Morris Hunt's architecture and those 13th-century stained glass windows and all that imported European splendor, $25,000 for what Oliver Belmont had spent millions building, and the Tinneys, who were antiques dealers and collectors, saw Belcourt not as a home but as a museum, a display case for their vast collection of European furniture and armor and tapestries and curiosities, and they did something remarkable. They restored it, they renamed it Belcourt Castle to make it sound more impressive, they reopened the sealed ballroom after 40 years. They filled the house with treasures including a replica gold coronation coach and an enormous Imperial Russian chandelier and more medieval armor than any private residence in America and Renaissance paintings and Flemish tapestries and French furniture and everything they had collected over decades of dealing, and they opened it to the public, started giving tours, telling stories about Oliver and Alva and the horses on the first floor and the Gothic ballroom on the second and the glittering parties and the Gilded Age excess, and for 56 years, from 1956 to 2012, the Tinney family maintained Belcourt, showed it to hundreds of thousands of visitors, kept it alive when it should have died, kept it intact when it should have been demolished, and Harold Tinney, who inherited the house from her father Donald, became convinced that Belcourt was haunted, wrote a book about the ghosts, conducted candlelight ghost tours, told stories about suits of armor that screamed and chairs that threw people and a monk who paced the sealed then reopened ballroom, and whether or not you believe in literal ghosts, Harold Tinney's ghost stories tell us something true about Belcourt. It is haunted by its own history, by the weight of its contradictions, by the beauty built on exploitation, by the fairy tale that was always also a nightmare, by the 30 servants whose labor made Oliver's parties possible and whose names we'll never know, by the sealed ballroom that spent 4 decades hidden from view because maintaining the performance became too expensive and too embarrassing, and perhaps most of all by the fundamental dishonesty of the entire Gilded Age project, the pretense that wealth equals taste, that display equals substance, that buying European antiquity grants you European legitimacy, when in fact the whole elaborate performance rested on theft, on exploitation, on the grinding machinery of a class system that treated human beings as property in everything but name. When Harold Tinney put Belcourt up for sale in 2009, asking millions of dollars for a house her family had bought for $25,000, the question was whether anyone would want it, whether these Gilded Age monuments had any value beyond their role as curiosities, as artifacts of a vanished age, and then in 2012, Carolyn Raphaelian appeared. And if Belcourt's story is about the cycle of American wealth, then Raphaelian's arrival represents the pattern repeating, because Raphaelian was a new money millionaire, the founder of Alex and Ani Jewelry Company, a woman who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, selling charm bracelets and spiritual jewelry to millions of customers, and she saw Belcourt and she wanted it, wanted to restore it, wanted to bring it back to its original Gilded Age glory, wanted to make it shine again the way it had shone for Oliver and Alva, and she bought it for $3.6 million and announced her intention to spare no expense on the restoration, and she kept her word. She poured $15 million into Belcourt by some estimates, she hired the best craftspeople, she stabilized the roof, she restored the Gothic ballroom to its full glory, she cleaned decades of grime from the walls and ceilings, she researched the original color schemes and furnishings, she repaired the 13th century stained glass, she restored the hammer beam ceiling, she upgraded all the systems, electrical and plumbing and heating. She won a Rhodey Award for Historic Preservation in 2018, and for a moment, for a brief shining moment, it seemed like Belcourt had found its perfect steward, its ideal owner, someone with the wealth and the will and the vision to maintain it forever, except of course it couldn't last, because it never lasts, because the pattern always repeats. And in 2019, Carolyn Raphaelian's jewelry empire began to collapse. Alex and Ani filed for bankruptcy in 2021, Raphaelian lost control of the company she had founded, lawsuits proliferated, her net worth plummeted from over $1 billion to a fraction of that, and suddenly the question became, what happens to Belcourt now? Can the restoration continue? Will the house survive another cycle of abandonment and decay? And in asking these questions, we're forced to confront what Belcourt really represents, because it's not just one house, it's a pattern, a template, a perfect microcosm of how American wealth operates across generations. First there's the creation phase when an immigrant outsider like August Belmont builds a fortune through timing and ruthlessness and strategic positioning during economic crisis. When he transforms himself from August Schönberg to August Belmont and hides his Jewish origins and buys his way into American aristocracy. Then there's the display phase when his son Oliver takes that fortune and converts it into cultural capital, building monuments that assert belonging, buying European antiquity to prove legitimacy, performing wealth so extravagantly that society has no choice but to acknowledge it. Then there's the transformation phase when Alva Belmont redirects that wealth toward political power, when she understands that social status is meaningless compared to actual rights, when she funds the suffrage movement and helps win the 19th Amendment. Then there's the decline phase when the original purpose of the house becomes obsolete, when changing economic realities make it impossible to maintain, when the ballroom gets sealed off and the house deteriorates and ownership passes to people who view it as a burden. Then there's the museum phase when someone like the Tinney family rescues it from demolition by transforming it into a tourist attraction. And finally there's the restoration phase when new money, a new generation of wealth, attempts to recover the original vision, to restore the fairy tale, except the pattern always repeats, the new wealth proves just as unstable as the old, the bankruptcy follows the boom, and Belcourt, that monument to the illusion of permanence, reveals the truth, nothing built on this foundation lasts. And when you stand in that Gothic ballroom today, restored to its former glory after being sealed off for decades, surrounded by 13th-century stained glass and medieval armor and hammer-beam ceilings, you have to ask yourself, what are we really looking at? Are we admiring beauty or commemorating violence? Are we celebrating architecture or mourning the human cost? And the answer is all of it simultaneously, because Belcourt contains multitudes, it is genuinely beautiful and genuinely exploitative, it represents real artistic achievement and real human suffering, it demonstrates extraordinary craftsmanship and extraordinary cruelty, and any honest telling of its story must hold all these contradictions in tension, must resist the temptation to make it either pure fairy tale or pure nightmare, because the truth is more complicated. Belcourt is what America looks like when you peel back the wallpaper, its Rothschild banking gold laundered through 3 generations into cultural legitimacy, its European antiquity deployed as social weaponry, its immigrant wealth performing American aristocracy, its beauty purchased with invisible labor, it's a sealed ballroom that reveals everything by being hidden, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the ballroom was sealed in 1920 because even the Belmonts couldn't maintain the performance anymore, and unsealing it now forces us to ask whether we're learning from history or doomed to repeat it, whether we're honoring the craft while acknowledging the exploitation or just buffing the surface while ignoring the rot beneath, and these questions matter because we're living through our own Gilded Age right now, we have our own billionaire class building monuments, performing philanthropy, sealing off uncomfortable questions, and maybe Belcourt, with its sealed ballroom finally restored and opened, can teach us something about that pattern, about the trajectory of wealth that builds palaces instead of communities, that performs civilization instead of creating justice, and if we're brave enough to ask the hard questions, to acknowledge both the beauty and the brutality, then maybe Belcourt can become more than a monument to wealth, maybe it can become a mirror reflecting our own choices, our own moment of decision. Because we too are building monuments, we too are sealing off uncomfortable truths, and the question is whether we'll unseal them before it's too late, before another generation looks at our palaces and asks what price was paid, and by whom, and whether anyone counted the cost before the music stopped and the chandeliers went dark and all that remained was an empty ballroom, beautiful and terrible and true.